lack of sight wasn't the reason why I wouldn't achieve something in life. And so I didn't want that to be the focus. And I come up with this phrase that, your eyes are useless unless you use what's between your ears. And so it was very much about how could I change my mindset? And I think what often stops anyone from taking on anything particularly challenging and overcoming anything difficult is also going to be a challenge, is getting really overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task itself. And so what's really important for us is to really just accept where we are and not kind of think too far down the road.
That's a wonderful achievement. We shouldn't be looking to turn the clock back, but it is about saying, well, where there have been big steps forward for some groups, huge societal changes, who's not coping so well with those changes? Why is that? Hi, my name's Andrew Payne and welcome to Men on Show. And today I am delighted to welcome Darren Harris, the captain of the Blind England football team, racking up over 160 appearances, 10 world and European medals. He is England's most capped blind footballer, which with more than 160 caps is not surprising. Dual Paralympian, recipient of an honorary doctorate, best-selling author, but not in spite of, but because of his blindness. And we're going to talk about that today. And we're also going to talk about, obviously, some of these other issues. I don't say bigger, but other issues such as men and masculinity. So, Darren, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome to Men on Show.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. Well, look, Darren, just to sort of start us off with, I was reading your bio and reading up on you because I know a bit about you anyway. We've met before. You were diagnosed with something called bilateral retinalblastoma at the age of 15 months. Now I know I don't recall anything really before I was like 4. Do you feel like, looking back now as a man, do you feel like you have any sort of subconscious fleeting memories of life with sight, or have you in your mind, have you always been blind, if that makes sense as a question?
So my treatment meant that I had one eye was removed and the other was treated with radiotherapy. So the eye that was treated with radiotherapy, I had vision in for quite a few years.
Ah,
That did,
okay.
yeah. So that deteriorated gradually, but I remember being able to see it, and even up to sort of the age of 12, I could still read print,
Oh, right.
even
Okay.
if it was enlarged. So yes, I remember being able to see.
And do you when the blindness sort of the total blindness occurred over from what you're saying, like perhaps a period of time, what was the impact on you at that time? Like, were you aware that it was getting worse, and you knew what was coming, or how was that for you?
I mean, I think you go through, the entire grief cycle, that that's quite well known in the world in terms of, the denial phase of just not really acknowledging it, accepting it, coming up with other reasons why you bumped into things such as the lighting or a lack of concentration. And then there's, the anger phase, which I obviously went through in terms of, why is this happening to me? And then that hope phase, really, where I was always going to the hospital every single year, hoping for this miracle cure. And doctors really telling me that my sight was getting worse and that there was nothing they could do about it. And that did leave me in a dark place, literally and metaphorically, I guess. So that was that kind of immediate impact in terms of, it affected how I thought in terms of, what sort of future would I have? Would I have a family? Would I ever have a job? All those things, but also that emotional impact it had on me in terms of just feeling helpless and hopeless at times.
And how old were you when you were experiencing, I mean, all of that kind of, when I say roller coaster sort of explosion of emotions, really difficult to handle for anyone, but were you handling it as a child?
Yes, I mean primarily as a teenager. I don't remember feeling that way when I was younger, even though my sight still wasn't perfect. But when I was in primary education, I don't remember feeling that way. Perhaps when I was start to be sort of 10, 11, I started to think about it more. And that was the age that I started learning Braille and learning to touch type. So there was definitely an idea amongst my teachers that I would need these skills even before I realized that, they were going to be really important for me going forwards.
Wow. I mean, that's a massive thing to process. My eldest boy is 10. If I sort of imagine him in that situation, I mean, that massive for you, massive for your parents. You've talked about obviously some of the processes of grief. Yeah, it starts with, doesn't it? Denial, is it anger, then sadness, I think, and then a
Yeah.
gradual sort of acceptance of the situation. What do you, was there anything at that time that really helped you kind of to accept and move forward in a helpful way?
Yeah, I mean, there were a few things. I mean, sport was definitely a focus for me and a way of, I suppose, distracting myself from the sort of the emotional and the mental turmoil. So sport just gave me this instant hit. It's the best antidepressant out there. It's great at reducing anxiety because you're very much in the moment. Sport's really mindful in fact that you only really think about the fact that your legs are hurting, your heart's beating like a drum, all those sorts of things. And I guess the other thing was just that I went to a school where it was a boarding school, but it was a grammar school as well, and I just met other blind kids. And even though I didn't have a particularly great time there, there was just things that they taught me in terms of how to deal with it, and I just started to come across people doing some amazing things as blind people, which I had never had up until that point. I didn't know any blind people when I was really young. So your only sort of perception of blindness is what you learn through how others react and respond to you, or and treat you, because they hear that you've got this ending disability sort of thing. So for me, it's watching guys who are totally blind ride a bike, for example, were things that just completely blew my mind. It was like, how on earth is this possible? And yes, I started to sort of see people doing some really cool stuff.
So that kind of acceptance as such of life, of how life was going to be for you now, that was very much, would you see that as a gradual unfolding of time where you're meeting people that are quite inspirational, but with the same condition that you have? It wasn't like you didn't have like a standout sort of moment of epiphany. It was like a gradual process, that acceptance.
For me, it was, yeah, it was, my sight deteriorated very gradually. It was never something I noticed day by day or week by week or even month by month. It would be thinking, oh, this time last year I could see this, and I used to be able to see that, and now I can't. And I guess that change in terms of my mindset was also very gradual. And it was only really sort of for a period of reflection where I started to sort of remember some sort of really key moments. But yeah, I don't think there wasn't a eureka moment for
Yeah.
me in the sense of that.
Yeah. And before we look at your work today, I do want to sort of really dive into the work you're doing today. But one of the thing I wanted to just touch on about your sort of story growing up, again, I read, I think it's on your website, that at 7, the age of 7, you recounted all 66 books of the Bible to your church. So obviously in church. What was the church kind of a key part of your upbringing that you recall?
Yeah, I was dragged to church kicking and screaming. It wasn't.
Dragged, kicking and screaming.
Yeah, I mean, my mum's side of the family were all quite religious, and we went to one of those very typical black Pentecostal churches, and I'd have to say that sort of the church experience has probably changed quite a lot from when I was a kid, but it was quite kind of hellfire and damnation when I used to go back then. But you know, one of the things I did engage with in church was the music, because there were just some fantastic musicians, and I'd
Yeah,
just go up to them afterwards and say, "How do you play that? And how do you play this?" And so
yeah,
that was one way. But also, I'm not quite sure how the idea of reading all the books, the Bible came along. Actually, I always used to set myself little challenges, memory challenges when I was a kid. So I would shuffle a pack of cards and then give it to my mum, and then see if I could recite it. So I used to play loads of sort of games and stuff on. There was a game called Simon. I don't know if you remember it. We had these sort of four colors, and you had to remember the patterns of these colors. And I was a big cuber. I was big into the Rubik's cube as well as a kid. So I think I always had a good memory, and it was just one of those sort of things. I just thought, oh, let's see if I can remember all the books of the Bible. And then someone came with the idea, well, why don't you recite it in front of a church? So that's what
yeah.
I did.
And did you, with what you were going through as a teenager, did faith play a part in wrestling with that, or yeah, did it play a part? Was it a big
Yeah,
part?
I'm not saying in a positive way for me. I've always found it a little disturbing to a certain degree, and actually, how could I think of blindness in a positive way, when people were always praying for me to have my sight restored. And
Yeah,
even now, I find myself, standing at a bus stop, and people will come and offer prayer for me for my sight to be restored. And actually, now I've gone for that complete phase where I have accepted it. And actually, if you were to say I could have my sight back tomorrow, I wouldn't have that. That's like not something that I'm really focused on. So I think it sometimes narrow people's thinking in terms of, oh, well, if I could see, my life would be immediately much better. But when actually I've come to realize that's not really the reality. And there were blind people who haven't had particularly positive lives, and there are people who can see who haven't had particularly positive lives. And there isn't sort of this causality of a relationship saying, oh, because I'm blind, my life's going to end up this particular way. So yeah, I didn't find it that kind of empowering or positive.
yeah,
It was sort of, it took away from, what can I do for myself to make my situation better.
yeah. Because I mean, I've got a faith, but I think faith, it can complicate issues such as like when do I keep persevering with something, and when would I walk away? If you have a faith, you always believe somehow that God might just rescue this situation, so I'll hang in there a little bit longer. And like you say, when do you accept something, and when do you say no? I keep praying because God can change this, and I do think faith, it can give us hope, which is a good thing, but it can complicate matters as well. And yeah, I've seen that in the church where people with an illness or a disability will be prayed for, and then if they're not healed, sort of the focus is, well, you obviously don't have enough faith that you can be healed, and that's obviously really 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 unhelpful. So that's interesting that you share that. And so today, obviously, you've gone into sport. You've achieved amazing things. What took you? I mean, you always loved sport, but did you ever think that you would perform at the higher levels that you have?
I never did sport with this vision of being a Paralympian or anything like that. I did sport as a kid because I loved doing sport, and it was one of those things which I did before school, break time, lunchtime, after school, weekends. It literally filled my life. I remember I used to do athletics. So I used to be in a running club when I was a kid, and I'd play football for like 2 or 3 hours, and then go to the running club. And I mean, even before the footballers training, we were just having fun. And I think that's so important. I meet loads of people who tell me they want to be professional athletes, and you ask them, how much they're doing, and are they part of a club, and are they receiving any coaching, and they say no, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
That's the starting point, really. If you're not engaged in it and doing lots of it, you're just never going to improve. So yeah, that was just something I did loads and loads of, but there wasn't really a pathway for sort of professional sport with a disability at that time. So I went down that traditional route of going to university and joining one of those graduate training programs and all of that. And when I began my sort of England blind football career, it was very much as an amateur. We didn't get paid or anything like that. I worked by day, and weekends and evenings I focused on training with football. So yeah, that's how I kind of then started to make that transition across.
Yeah, interesting. And you obviously, your sort of slogan or your main sort of focus of your work is sort of called unblind the mind today. What's the thinking behind that, Darren?
It came about because a little bit what I was saying before in terms of I realized that lack of sight wasn't the reason why I wouldn't achieve something in life. And so I didn't want that to be the focus. And I come up with this phrase that, your eyes are useless unless you use what's between your ears. And so it was very much about how could I change my mindset whereby I didn't think of blindness as something that was negative, that was something that was gonna uh, um, make myself less successful, as it were. But was there a positive way to think of my blindness? Could it enable me to do things that I wouldn't have done had I been able to see? And so I started to re-engineer how I thought about blindness. And I realized that for me to go on and accomplish all the things I wanted to do, it wasn't something that I wanted to be ashamed of or feel in any way negative about. And it's not that I haven't had some of those experiences, but I realized that the challenge for me was to reframe all of my thinking in terms of how I perceive blindness.
And is that at the heart of your resilience message?
Yeah, in terms of how we think, yeah, how
Yeah.
how we think ultimately is going to impact what we do, and also how we feel. So changing your thinking about something is massively important. And it's something I've used all from my career as an athlete. I realized that the mind was so powerful. I was really lucky to work with some really top sort of psychologists, and those are the things that we focused on, dealing with negative self-talk, thinking about how we can regulate our emotions, in the moment. And it's really easy after a game or after a talk or after any event that you go through, a job interview, to reflect and think about all the things that you could have done differently. And the challenge always is about how you can do that in the moment. I think that's
Yeah.
what sort of really separates the very best from the rest.
So, and definitely to sort of pick your brains while we've got you, Darren, given the adversity that you've overcome and continue to do in the life that you lead. I know that you're planning a marathon next year. And given that you speak on resilience to businesses, schools, colleges, and the rest, if you could just share, one tip. Let's imagine I'm struggling in my life. I've been hit on a few different points, and I feel like I'm in a bad way. What kind of is what would be your most important resilience tip to get someone started? I want to be more resilient tomorrow than I am today. So what's the starting tip you'd give someone?
I think for me, it was always just accepting where I am. Like, this is my starting point. You mentioned the marathon. Actually, I did the marathon a couple of months ago, so I don't think I'm doing one next year. But I did one in October, and I think what often stops anyone from in sort of taking on anything particularly challenging and overcoming anything difficult is also going to be a challenge. Is getting really overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task itself. And so what's really important for us is to really just accept where we are and not kind of think too far down the road.
Yeah.
So that's the simplest thing to do, is just accept where you are.
I love that. I because in some of the speaking stuff that I deliver on, I talk about grit, and there is a book on grit, funnily enough, called Grit by Angela Duckworth. Have you read it, Darren?
No, but I do
Oh,
know about her
yeah,
work. I've never read her
yeah.
actual
So
book.
she
Yeah.
she's done some amazing work on grit. Very well researched, and she talks about grit being where passion and perseverance kind of collide and intersect. So you find your passion with something, you're more likely to persevere. But the one word that I feel is missing from the book, and I say this again and again and again when I do my talks, is acceptance. She doesn't really talk about acceptance as a thing, and I think that is so important for me. It is the missing ingredient. Working out, if you're struggling in life, what are the things that I just need to accept today that I can't change? I need to stop wasting energy fighting against them. I just need to accept them. I think that's a really good starting point. I love the fact that you've picked on that as your sort of key starting point on this podcast. Moving the conversation slightly towards men and masculinity, there's so many mixed messages about men, I feel, in the press. On the one hand, we have the privilege, the upper hand, we've retained power, and there's like a wrestle, sort of people wrestling power from our sort of hands. But then we know from the stats for men and boys, we make up 85% of rough sleepers. We're more likely to be victims of violence than women or girls, but there's no official government strategy to tackle violence against men and boys. We know that the greater majority, sort of 3/4 of people that die by suicide are men, 95% of people in prison are men. Most people listening to these podcasts will know these stats. So, do you think men and boys are struggling from what you see? Because you do a lot of work in schools.
Yeah. I
Um,
think it's, I suppose it's always important to make the distinction that there's as much variation within sexes as there is between sexes. And so whilst when we're kind of making these sort of really global comparisons between men and women, it's important to realize that actually there's a massive variation within men. And so there are definitely some men who are struggling, and perhaps they're the ones which represent, I know, a lot of the stats that you've just mentioned, but there are obviously lots of men who are also achieving. So the two things aren't mutually exclusive. I think that the group of men who are struggling and boys that I come across in schools, I think, yeah, that some of the changes that have occurred in society and in structures, and there are a multitude of reasons we could go into as to why some men are struggling, in terms of a lack of male role models. So one of the things that's obvious from so many schools I go into, especially primary schools, is that there are a handful of male teachers. And that's not for a lack of senior leadership teams wanting there to be men in schools, but the ones I've spoken to are saying that men aren't applying for those roles. Men aren't applying to be primary school teachers, for example. And so maybe this is for us to address. If we feel that there's a lack of male role models within schools, and we want more male teachers, then more of us need to put our hands up and take on some of those roles. There's obviously a lack of fathers in the home. My father was absent, and that's a problem which seems to be continuing in that particular direction. And I suppose the other big area is that there's a different set of skills we need, I think, to kind of cope with today's society that we probably didn't need maybe 10 or 20, 30 years ago. And if you think about the change to the workplace in terms of that, men, we used to be able to, when we had lots of manufacturing jobs, for example, you were able to earn a good living doing a manufacturing job where you didn't necessarily need certain skills, and a lot of those have been replaced, for example, with service sector jobs, which have got a completely different skill set. they both might be considered as sort of entry level jobs, but they are completely different skill sets. And I suppose so there is a massive section of the society that are basically underprepared, underskilled for sort of some of the challenges of modern day life. And I think that is having an impact on a certain section of men.
Yeah, I think that's really, really insightful, Darren. I don't know if you've read the work of Richard Reeves, but he talks about, 150 years ago, the vast majority of paid jobs involved elements of heavy lifting, which, if according to the American Bureau of Labor, is where you're lifting items regularly that are between 12 and 20 kilos. So there was a need for human brawn in the workplace. So you're
Yes.
right, this helped guys in the workplace. But today, the vast majority of jobs have no heavy lifting. So the need for human brawn has gone. Of course, the workplace, in terms of socially, society has become more fast-paced, more complex. We've seen, and it's a wonderful thing. I love the fact that in many countries we've seen the emancipation of women. In the 1980s, 4% of lawyers were women, only 4%. And that's not that long ago, but today we're at 46%. That's a wonderful achievement. We shouldn't be looking to turn the clock back, but it is about saying, well, where there have been big steps forward for some groups, huge societal changes, who's not coping so well with those changes? Why is that? How do we help them? These are really important questions. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of the changing workplace that has had an impact on guys. And there is definitely a need for development skills. And of course, we have to remember that boys and girls' brains develop very quickly at a very different pace. Infant girls' brains develop much more quickly than boys, but we put them in the classroom at the same age and then wonder why so many of the boys are falling behind. Then I suppose you add to that fatherlessness and some of these other adverse childhood experiences. It's not surprising that we have so many issues with our young boys. I suppose for me, I don't know what your take is. I'm going to ask you in a moment, but one of the things that bothers me about the term toxic masculinity, which is bandied around to describe all manner of things. Not only is it a lazy term, but also because people behave badly, whether they're men or women, for a whole variety of reasons, but also for our young men and boys that may not be behaving so well, certain groups, they may be struggling. I see toxic masculinity as more of a wall builder than a bridge builder. I often say that. What's your view of the term toxic masculinity? Because you do a lot of stuff in schools. No doubt you hear that term a lot. What's your own perception of that as a phrase?
Yeah, I think it's always helpful to sort of stay away from those sorts of blanket labels. That they're yeah, I think you say about it in terms of it being lazy and I think of all levels of language, even things that we think we do understand and know well, some people interpret things differently to others. So if people do use it, I don't think we're ever going to remove terms from the lexicon of language, but when people do use those terms, you just ask, so what do you mean by that? And you use that to open up a conversation. So I think, rather than sort of banning phrases or asking people to not use it, it's asking them probably to sort of clarify what it is they mean by that, and then using that as a conversation starter. So that's how I would deal with it. But I do hear it bandied about, but not that much, to be honest. Not certainly not in schools. I don't hear it talked about. It tends to be, on particular sort of TV shows and those sorts of discussion things. But I tend to avoid those anyway, if I'm honest.
Yeah, no, I mean, I worked with a school not that long ago where the teachers, they don't use the word themselves, toxic masculinity, but where the kids do, they obviously have these honest and real conversations, understanding actually that men and women can be completely brutal and cruel to each other, to the other gender, to their own gender, and that it's more sort of, these are destructive people tendencies that people have. So what's at the root of it? How do we deal with it? In terms of helping men and boys, in terms of creating better outcomes for our young men, creating better outcomes for our male colleagues, What are some of the things that we need to be doing practically in society?
I'm biased, but I do think sport is transformational in so many ways, and I think we do sell sport really badly because most people think about it in terms of losing weight, getting fit, or getting big muscles, and I can categorically say that sport has done so much more for me than that. It's helped me develop communication skills, leadership, teamwork, resilience, confidence, every facet of life that you could think of. I can say that
Yeah,
sport has given me a way of having some insight into that. Um, and I think the reduction of sport within schools has had a detrimental effect on people in a myriad of ways. We're talking about um, people's lack of focus and attention. So there's much more emphasis on people with ADHD, and it's almost like we've normalized sitting still for 7 hours a day, and wondering why people are getting fidgety, and then labeling them and medicating them, when actually lots of kids have got a propensity to move and be
yeah.
active, and can we still learn in an active way? So I think there are some there's some real practical things around that, and perhaps there are some gender differences in boys being more active, and even for the girls who are who are their role models. So in lots and lots of schools, they're bringing in external people to do their PE because maybe some of the teachers don't want to do the PE with the kids. So I think it works for everybody. So that'd be one practical thing I would do, is not think that sport is taking away from our kids time to read and to write, and to realize that actually it could uh, complement it in in a really positive way.
I love that you've said that, Darren, because of all the guests that I've had on Men on Share, I always ask this question, as you can probably imagine. You're the first one to say sport, and I think it's good, rather than saying, well, we could do a bit of this, bit of that. You've opened that up as a key topic, and it's so right in what you say, and just really adding to what you said. One of the reasons why boys are more likely to be more fidgety than girls is when they're teenagers and they go through male puberty, they have 30 times more testosterone in their system than equivalent age girls. It's no wonder they can't sit still. And I remember sitting in classrooms as a teenager being so bored, so restless, so fidgety. And I would have loved to have had a PE session every day. I probably needed that. I would have probably focused better in the other time in the day if I'd have had that. And I think that it's so important in terms of concentration, well-being, and possibly, although it's important for both genders, I absolutely agree with that fully. Due to the testosterone element, biologically, we are different. And again, you pointed that out yourself. It may be even more important for guys. I think it really is important around communication skills, enjoyment, self-confidence. As you say, it's not just about being fit. And I know that I talk most openly after a game of football. We head to the pub, and if you want me to open up about anything, that would be the time to do it. I'm on fire after game. Even if I've had a rubbish game, I feel like I'm on fire in a really good way. So I mean, that's a fantastic answer. And like I say, you're the first guest to say sports. How do you feel about that?
Well, unique, yeah. I think it's just, it's one of the great losses. I think when I was in primary school, and unless my memory's absolutely faulty, I seem to remember that we had an afternoon of sport a couple of times a week, and I know, being a school governor as I am now, that it's a real challenge to fit uh, more sport into curriculum, because we have so many targets in terms of
Yeah.
everything else. But it always seems to be framed as an either or. Um, and yet I think there is lots and lots of evidence that sport and exercise actually increases our brain processing speed, increases neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. So it has a positive impact on our brains, and actually will enable, I think, some of those children to learn better. And that actually, if they've just let off a bit of steam, now they are in a good position to sit down and actually learn, because they're physically tired, but they're still mentally alert. And so then they can probably pay a bit more attention in the classroom.
Because I think it's also self-discipline, a sense of being okay that you've lost, and there's so much emotional stuff that goes with it. A school that my grown-up daughters went to, for their sports day, they'd have a morning where all the kids participated and did fun stuff. Then in the afternoon, they'd have a section for what they called the gifted and talented, where they'd really race them and medals and all that stuff. And there'd be parents that would complain about the gifted and talented section. They'd say it was elitist, it wasn't fair on the kids that weren't gifted and talented. So I do think sports, it can be one of these emotional things, can't it, that can almost create quite irrational debate. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, people are afraid of competition, and rightly so. So competition works well between people who are at similar levels. So
Yeah.
that's really important to know. And I think when you have competition between people who aren't similar levels, then you get those really unfortunate and unpleasant situations where people completely disengage. So, if you've got the fastest and the slowest in the same event, the fastest doesn't really need to try because they know they're going to win,
Yeah.
and the slowest doesn't try either because they know they're going to lose, and that's not helpful for either.
No.
So I think it's really important that how we structure the sessions and how we put them together, so that we're getting people of similar ability, competing against each other.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, I think the way,
that's going to
yeah.
get the best out of everyone.
Yeah, I think the way the school did it was great. That was my own perception. But yeah, no, I mean, listen, really insightful stuff. Really appreciate you being on the show today. I always finish a podcast with the same two things. First is, how do people get hold of you, Darren? Because you're a brilliant speaker, talking so much about adversity, resilience, diversity as well. How do people get hold of you?
I am on the World Wide Web, so darrenharrisgb.com is my website, and that's probably the best place to go. And I'm obviously on most social media channels as well at Darren Harris GB.
Darren Harris, GB. Okay, love that. And finally, the final thing to wrap this up. If you just had a couple of sentences to give men, young and old, listening to this podcast, a message of encouragement, a message of hope, what would that be in a couple of sentences?
I think there's a lot of reasons to be positive, and I think we can always focus on the negatives. And I just think it's time for us to really step up. And I've always said, actually, that it's really easy for, if someone was to criticize my dad, I probably would defend him. But I know that he hasn't been the best dad possible, and so it's for us to challenge each other to step up. And perhaps when other people do it, we might not kind of connect. But when we challenge each other and we say, boys, men, we have to step up and do better, it's that we're the best people to do that.
Okay. But so what I got from that was, focus on the positives, step up, and don't be afraid to respectfully challenge others to step up. Is that the sum of it?
Absolutely. Yeah. We
Fabulous.
can
Well,
do
what a
better.
great way to end the podcast. Darren, thank you so much for your time. I know how busy you are with all the work you do, that you've given it to Men on Show, given your time so freely. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you again for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks for having me.